Hi, my name is Melissa Wilson. I'm an associate professor and state extension specialist in manure management at the University of Minnesota. With the topic of manure, it broaches into biosecurity, and you've been doing some work on mortality management and what we do with it after mortality management. Why is it so important to consider not only the mortality composting process, but what happens after? So anytime we're recycling any kind of animal mortality compost or anything like that, never mind, I don't want that straight. So whenever we're thinking of mortality compost, we can think of it as having nutrients that we want to recycle. As we're composting it and trying to preserve nutrients, or maybe they transition to new forms, that sort of thing, thinking about how we're going to land apply it and use it afterwards is what's going to be important. Why is that often overlooked? I think sometimes it's often overlooked because people are really thinking about that biosecurity aspect and they're not thinking about what are they going to do after they kill all the germs and that sort of thing. But again, it's still important to use those nutrients and be able to recycle them as much as possible. So that way we're closing the loop, so to speak. Yeah. We've talked a little bit yesterday about how biosecurity is such an in the moment activity where you can even forget the number to 911 as the analogy used. And so the nutrient management takes some planning. How can we prepare for using compost? How do we prepare to use compost after our mortalities are done composting? So it always comes down to, do you have a good nutrient management plan for your farm? Always thinking about what field soil tests look like, what the compost tests look like. So what nutrients do you need in your fields and for your crops? And then what nutrients do you have in your mortality compost are going to be key ingredients for figuring out what you're going to do with that compost. So knowing these ahead of time, at least the soil tests, and knowing where you think you want to go with the nutrients can be important. We often joke that no two manures are alike, and I assume that the same goes for compost material too. How do we manage that variability or that unknown? Yeah, managing our variability is going to be important for thinking about where we're going to put the nutrients as well from the mortality compost. But sampling is going to be key, and making sure that if it's not well mixed, that means you're going to need to sample from more spaces. So getting little grab samples from deep within the pile, near the surface, near the top, near the bottom is going to be key for making sure that you're accounting for some of that variability. Mixing it up really well and then taking a small grab sample, putting it in a bag, and then freezing it or sending it to a lab immediately is going to help preserve some of the nutrients in the way they were in the pile so that you know what you're going to be land applying. One of the other key things to think about is if you are going to apply it or grab samples during application, that may be a little more mixed a little bit better. But again, just grabbing samples as you go from every load can be helpful in reducing some of that variability. What are some of the similarities and differences between manure and mortality compost that you've observed? Yeah, there's definitely some differences between manure and mortality compost. With mortality compost, it tends to have a lot more of the composting material still left over. Oftentimes, people think of compost looking a certain way. It's really dirt or dark in color and really soil-like almost. Whereas the mortality compost we've worked with still has a lot of the carbon material still in it. So whether it's wood chips, it's corn stalks, it's wheat straw, we still see a lot of that after the mortality composting is over. So that's going to be really different than a raw manure, which may or may not have more or less bedding in it. So that's something that farmers will want to keep in mind when working with mortality compost is if you have a lot of bedding, you might tie up some of the nutrients right after application. So take that into consideration. When we're using carbon materials like wood chips, we've actually seen that will not supply any nitrogen, even though there's been mortality compost in there, because the nitrogen kind of gets tied up for the microbes that are trying to break down all of that carbon material in there. So it depends on the carbon source that you have, but they're usually still sticking around in the mortality compost. So I'm going to have you describe to an engineer why it's important to consider that amount of carbon relative to that amount of nitrogen that's in, whether it's the mortality compost or the manure. How does that carbon influence what happens in the soil? Yeah. So one of the things that's important in composting and in nitrogen cycling in the soil is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I like to think about it like this. There are microbes that break down everything. They decompose things, whatever it may be. They need carbon. That's what they're actually breaking apart to gain energy. And that's like we all do. We need carbon bonds, and then we break those bonds and we get the energy from it. Now, everything also needs certain other nutrients too. So they need so much nitrogen, so much phosphorus, potassium, so on and so forth. And we often think of nitrogen cycling as being really key to this. So that carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be important. You need a lot of carbon and you need a smaller amount of nitrogen. But if you end up having closer to one, you're going to have so much nitrogen that it's not going to be limiting to those microbes. But if you have only a little bit, tiny bit of nitrogen, then those microbes are only going to be able to break down so much of the carbon because they still need more nitrogen. In composting, what we need is that right ratio in order to break down all the things that we need to break down, like mortality compost. And then when we get it in the soil, it's important because the soil also has nitrogen. And if you have too much carbon but not enough nitrogen in the compost, all of a sudden they're going to start stealing nitrogen from the soil, which means it's no longer available for plants. So that carbon to nitrogen ratio of the material that you're applying to the land is going to be really important, and it's mainly because of microbes.
What materials have you looked at from a land application perspective? What carbon sources have you looked at, and what are some of your observations or data, if you have that?
So in our study, we were doing mortality compost of swine mortalities, and we looked at wood chips as a carbon source. We looked at corn stalks as the carbon source, and we looked at wheat straw as the carbon source. We had those composted and then land applied them the following year. So it was about a year after the composting happened. And what we found is that the wood chips did not provide nitrogen to the following corn crop pretty much at all. Like they supplied some of the other nutrients, but it was not a nitrogen source. And probably because those microbes tied up some of the nitrogen when they were trying to break down all the wood chips that were left over. Corn stalks and wheat straw did supply some nitrogen, but it was still not as much as we would have expected coming from like a true compost that is, again, kind of more of that like dirt material at the end that you would think of. So I think there was still some tie up of the nitrogen based on those carbon sources. But the wood chips were definitely like, it was like you didn't apply any nitrogen at all, even though we had applied, significant amount. So
should we consider mortality compost then a source of nutrients or more as a soil amendment?
that's always the age-old question. Is it nutrients or is it amendment? Well, I'd say in this case, it can be both, particularly if you're using carbon sources that aren't going to tie up as much of the nitrogen, maybe like the corn stalk and wheat straw. It can provide some nitrogen. And think of it as more of like a slow release. Like over several years, you'll probably get low levels of nitrogen. But the phosphorus, the potassium, all of those things will be in there too. And again, that carbon source will really dictate how much of those nutrients are there. Because if you have something that's a high potassium source, like if for some reason you threw some alfalfa into the compost, that might have high potassium in it. So that will then have more of be more of a resource for the following crop too. So it'll depend.